Hey everybody, welcome to the Wellman's podcast. Here today joined by my co-host Brian, and we are really excited about the topic today, zombies and tricksters and how that relates to real life. And I'm very excited about our guest, Kate Fowkes. She is a professor of media studies at High Point University. She's been there for over 25 years. She has a PhD in critical and cultural media studies and a Masters of Arts in Screenwriting from UT Austin. Also is fluent in French and has a Bachelor's of Arts in French Literature from Reed College. She has publications in 2 books, The Fantasy Film, and her next publication will be an anthology called Satan and Cinema, which is not yet in print, but I guess it's coming out soon. Also, Kate has this incredibly funny blog that you really should check out. Every time I read it, it makes me laugh. So if you need something to brighten up your day, check out her blog. Anyway, her blog is Kate, KATELIGHT blog.wordpress.com. Welcome to the show, Kate. I'm very excited to have you on. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. I'm not sure how I got on this podcast. It's about wellness.
This is about wellness. You got on it because you're funny as hell. That's why.
I know you're not going to ask me about my prodigious potato chip habit, especially because you had binge eating last week. But that's just why I love Keone, because he invited me on anyway.
That's right. Yeah, we were going to use you as an example for binge eating, but I decided against it. I decided this would be the best topic for you.
Potato chip shaming. It's just not you.
That's right. That's right.
But I will say, zombies versus trickster, it is actually about wellness. If most of your blogs are about wellness, it really is.
Explain.
Well, you'll find out.
Okay. All right. Well, then tell me, Kate, what is a zombie and what is a trickster? How are you defining that?
Well, why don't I ask you in just one sentence, each of you, in one sentence, to tell me what comes to mind when you think of a zombie.
All right.
Then, let's try zombie first.
All right. So for me, I think of a zombie as somebody walking, the Walking Dead, the stereotypical zombie that kind of has no conscience, just is just walking through life and is kind of controlled by some evil, nefarious force or something. That's the way I think of a zombie. And I think of a trickster who kind of maybe gets enjoyment out of causing disorganization or causing chaos or a trickster as maybe in a beneficial way tricks us to help us think better too. So I don't necessarily think of a trickster as somebody that is evil or doing nefarious things.
Yeah. Okay. And then Brian, you want to?
Yeah, with zombie, I definitely think of mindlessness. So that is the first thing that comes to my mind. And then with the tricksters, I definitely have to go with Keone. But I would say naturally I'm more inclined to think of trickster being more nefarious, having a more negative connotation than zombie.
Okay. So this is why when I gave the notes to Keone, I said zombies versus tricksters, because ultimately there is a little bit of ambiguity about tricksters. I don't think either of you, if you were given the choice, who do I want to encounter? Even you, Brian, you're a little worried the trickster might be evil. Mm-hmm. Even you would probably say, I'd rather meet a trickster than a zombie. Wouldn't you?
Certainly, if I could take the zombie out pretty easily.
You can't take zombies out very easily.
So trickster it is, definitely.
So that sets us up with like a really just basic idea of those two. Let me add a few things and then we'll expand it a lot. For the zombie, I would also say they're scary and violent. Eat your brain. a lot of them. Okay, so Brian, honey, you really don't want to meet up with the zombie.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true. I don't want to do that.
Now, there are a lot of different kind of tricksters. There's been tricksters in all kinds of folk tales and myths all over the world since the beginning of time. And there can be variations, and there can be some that are more nefarious. I happen to be enamored of the tricksters that do what Keone says, which is that they are tricky, but they bring something good to us. And part of how they do that is through humor. In stories about tricksters, they're always humorous. Not to say that you can't have a humorous zombie, but we can go there later. Okay, so let's just say that's the starting very simple definition of those two. So what I'm saying is, why do I say this one versus that one? Because ultimately, I think that the trickster is an antidote to what the zombie is. The perfect antidote. And why do we care? Because these look like these are fictional characters or they're mythical characters, right? So by way of sort of front-loading how I want to talk about tricksters and zombies, let me just kind of go down a couple of different ways we can look at this. So you can look at zombies and tricksters as characters or figures in fictional stories, right? But you have to always remember that they're in a story.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the story that's being told? So you have to ask yourself why, like zombies have gotten so popular in movies and television, right? So we have zombies and vampires. So why do people want to keep seeing these stories, these movies or TV shows or whatever about these kinds of figures? So you have to ask yourself, why is the culture telling these stories? What do we get out of them personally? And what do they say about our culture? Okay, so that I just put that out there. Moving forward, this is kind of a preview of how we could talk about them. You could also think about zombies and tricksters in a kind of a Jungian archetypal sense. I don't think Jung would have said that. I don't think he had zombies as an archetype. But if you think of archetypes as kind of stock characters, well, Jung would say, well, they were all parts of our psyche. Everybody has these parts to them, right? And trickster was certainly one that he had. And if you were Jung, you would say, well, we need to have these parts of our psyches in balance. So to give you an example of a very easy one to grasp that would pertain to our lives, the female and the male sides of people. You can wear different parts of your psyche on your sleeve, so to speak. You can project more of a male or more of a female. If you're healthy, you should have a balance. I think we can now to go to like, how can we apply some of this? You can look at some figures in politics, shall we say, who are like way out of balance on what would be that kind of thing. Okay, so we can look at it, what we get out of thinking about fictional tricksters and zombies, what we get out of it as an individual thinking about our own psyches. Okay, then further, we can think about these characters or figures as having a narrative function. They're in stories and they have a purpose to do something. What is it? Mm-hmm. And it's not just interesting at the level of the story. Now we can see these figures operating as human impulses. What is the impulse of a trickster? What's driving the trickster? What's driving the zombie? And then, so that's again on an individual level. And then the final thing is then we can say, we can see what they do as a kind of a state of being in the culture. Do we want to live in a zombie culture?
Right.
No.
Or do we want something else? And so that loops us back around where we started, from what kinds of stories are we telling? What are we saying to ourselves? What do we want? So that kind of previews the very kind of different ways you can think about zombies and tricksters. So now what?
Well,
so
let
me say this. Cami, you always say, I mean, I hear you kind of say, I hate all these like superhero movies, all this, you know, like formulaic, blah, 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 right? Am I right?
Yeah. I can't get into the stereotypical Hollywood superhero movie.
Right.
Can't.
I didn't realize we had that in common, Keone. I'm glad.
Good.
So I want to get back to whether like the mainstream movies are good or bad or whatever.
Okay.
But one thing I want to do is think about movies in general, and the fact that tricksters and zombies have a kind of a symbolic purpose. And movies and television, mass media are all filled with symbols and things.
Mm-hmm.
So what good is it to think about this, right? So I've tried to sort of preview that if looking at fictional stories, we can do things with them that are more than just entertainment, right?
Okay, right.
So let me tell you, so I told you I was going to have a series of anecdotes. They're pretty short.
Okay.
So years ago, as I was about to become a professor, about to finish my PhD, my husband and I went on a vacation in Alaska, and we were in a bed and breakfast, and we met this fellow from, I think he was from Australia, and he asked me, you know, what do I do? And I told him, well, I study movies, I analyze them, and he was like, what? That's ridiculous. What good is that? Like, what? And he started to criticize me, and his basic criticism was, it's no good because you can't eat it, right? As a kind of a metaphor for it's just not useful. Nothing comes of it. It's not productive. You can't eat it.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I'm on vacation. Did I mention I'm on vacation? Criticized. But anyway, so we just kind of like backed slowly away from this guy. So now let me tell you a story about a trickster from way back. You've heard of Hermes?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hermes, the Greek god? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's a demigod.
Yep.
Okay, so this is a story that I got from Lewis Hyde, who wrote a great book called Trickster Makes This World. And there's a hint here to what I like about the trickster. Trickster makes this world. Trickster is essential in some way. So he tells a story about how Hermes is not a full god, he's a demigod, and he gets hungry. And the gods have taken all the cattle, and dang, he wants some of it. So he steals it, but he's a trickster, so he does it in a tricky way. So he makes the cattle go back and forth so they can't tell whether they're coming or going, and he makes these shoes that have neither a discernible heel nor toe, so they can't tell which way they're coming or going. So that's the trickiness of his desire to steal. Now, a lot of tricksters do operate out of their id, their lust for something, but not all of them do. In this case, he does. But here's the point of the story. When he gets the cattle, instead of eating it, he makes a sacrifice. He makes a symbolic sacrifice, so that the point of having stolen the cattle, it was not for his own benefit, not to eat it. It's to and this is part of what a lot of the ancient myths did, right? They explain something. How did something come to be?
Mhm.
Why are things the way they are? So the point of the story is that Hermes ushers in a new era where you don't have to eat it. You have a symbol, you have a representation of something. And that symbol and that meaning will be there long after the cattle is gone. Okay? So what I'm trying to do is establish the importance of symbols and representation, and the fact that we live in a world filled with symbols and representation, right? Especially now in a mediated world, but it's been like that for a long time. So we really need to pay attention to our relationship to symbols and representations.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So
yeah, every culture has had them throughout the ages.
right. So it's just even more intense now with you know, if you think of, you've got the 5 senses. Of course, I have 6. That's just
I know that.
you have your 5 senses. How much of what you know in the world came from just you and your 5 senses? So much comes from some representation, some mediated version of what's going on in the world, right? So it's critical. So, and then, you know, going back to Jung and the archetypes and all this, he would say our whole world is filled with symbols, not just our stories, our dreams, everything we look at has symbolic content to it.
Right.
So just to make a kind of a segue here, this is kind of a funny story. Do you know what synchronicity is, Keone?
I have an idea. Yes.
Okay. What do you think it is?
So I think
I know you
synchronicity.
didn't expect a quiz, but I'm gonna
That's why I would shake my head no. I'll just vote with no.
Always shake your head. No,
Just like-
you're the smart one of the group, Brian.
All right, Keone, now you speak for us.
Synchronicity. I think a
Multiple
synchronicity. I think a synchronicity as kind of like what would it be? Where maybe you have a thought in your head that, for example, you're thinking about doing you're looking for a job, for example. You're looking for a job and you run into somebody on the street and this particular job, you run into somebody on the street and this particular job, this person, you just have a conversation with them. And then all of a sudden you see that they may be the key to getting to this particular job. Is that an example of synchronicity, kind of? All right, cool. Thank you, Professor Fowkes. Okay.
So why is this relevant? Okay, so let me now run down a couple of other things about the trickster and what that has to do with synchronicity. Okay. So tricksters can be varied across the world and across time, but here are some things that we could say about a trickster. They are tricky and mischievous. They can be deceptive. They can tell lies, but they are, to put it in Lewis Hyde's words, they are amoral, not immoral. They tend to flatten hierarchies, reverse situations, particularly power structures, and they are very good at poking holes in what look like ironclad ideas, with what looks like that's normal, that's the way the world is, it can't be any other way. They're very good at that. And part of what Jung was actually the one who made this idea of synchronicity popular. And I think that the trickster figure lives in that world of synchronicity, which is to say that you think that you're here and that stuff is there, or I'm here and you're there, you know, which we are, but we're also connected in ways that we don't think about, right? Like get out of the Cartesian mind separate from body, me separate from world. And synchronicity is actually an example of something manifesting itself that's connected, but that we have not recognized. So here's my anecdote, which ties it back to the Hermes story. I was on sabbatical researching the trickster to do a book about the trickster rabbit in cinema. Can you think of a trickster rabbit in some sort of television or film?
Bugs Bunny.
Bugs Bunny, okay. And there are actually quite a few trickster rabbits, which is why I was going to write a book on it. So I was researching this, and while I was doing it, I was reading about folklore, and I was reading Carl Jung, and I came across the synchronicity idea and manifesting something. And people are saying, well, you can actually manifest something about what's out there. So I say to myself, I'm going to try to manifest something. What would I like? I would like an owl. I'm sitting on my deck, my upstairs outdoor deck. You know it, Keone, right? It's up in the trees.
It's beautiful.
I'm sitting there, my beautiful upstairs deck under the trees on a red couch, all dressed in white. And all afternoon, I try to manifest an owl, and dang, it doesn't happen. So I tell my husband, shoot, all day long I've been trying to manifest an owl because we hardly get any owls, and I just thought it'd be cool. I'm a miserable failure. I'm going to bed. I go to bed. I wake up in the morning. I open the local paper, and on the front page of the art section is a story about a gallery opening downtown, and there's a painting that they've put like this big, and it's of a blonde-haired woman all dressed in white on a red couch under the trees with an owl. So I didn't get the owl. I got the symbolic version of the owl. Pretty good, huh?
Yeah, you're good. You're real good. I want that power.
Pretty good. Okay, so here's the thing about what I think about zombies. Do you want to be a zombie? You certainly don't get eaten by one. Do you want to be one?
No.
No, I don't. But I think a lot of people are unknowingly. And maybe I am in a lot of ways too.
Yeah. So this is what I think is why I think we could include the zombie as a kind of a Jungian archetype as a part of who we are. All right, I'll put this one to Brian. Have you ever found yourself driving along and then realize you really paid no attention to where you were going or what you were, like your mind was someplace else and yet you still, ever happened to you?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, right. So the fact is, we have to all be on autopilot lots of the time, which is very zombie-like. So it is part of us. We'd be overwhelmed if we didn't have that. But the question is, do we want to have that be the dominant part of our personality? And I think we would say no, right? So zombies go around, they're not thinking, they're violent, they're monsters, right? And so I would relate this to a way of thinking which is very rigid. They have there's no subtlety, there's no imagination, there's no love, there's no rational thought, there's nothing of what we would associate with our humanity. And let me just put the caveat there, and Keone knows this about me, that by saying humanity, I don't mean I think humans are better than other animals. Humans are animals. But let's just bracket that off and say, what do we think of as being humans? So what I think is the trickster is the perfect foil for people or world that's gotten sort of petrified and zombified, right? So the trickster uses humor to point out the boundaries and the stereotypes that have started to look normal to us. So we can't really even see them in a lot of cases. So the trickster comes along and kind of gooses things, causes chaos. And in a movie, let's say, the characters who are getting goosed may not like it, but we as the viewer will probably find it funny because that's part of the trickster. So if you want to apply this to the real world, think of all the people who are kind of zombified in their thinking, who think they know everything, they know the way it is, and it's a very black and white world. It's us versus them.
Mm-hmm.
And the trickster wants to say, it's not that. The world looks like it's a dichotomy. It's black versus white, us versus them, whatever, but it's really a lot more subtle than that. So for instance, this was in my book. Let me find this. If you can see this, I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah, yep.
This is a famous optical illusion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure the proportions are serving us well here, but what do you see?
I see a duck or a bird.
I'll go with the bunny rabbit then.
Okay, so this is the classic thing. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit, right?
Right.
So the point of this in my book was to say it could be both.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so to me, the trickster comes in and points out that it's both. Here's another one I like. So while I was working on the bunny book, my husband finds me in New Zealand an umbrella. It's big, looks like a big carrot, but it's a rabbit. So you can say carrot, you can get somebody to do something by, like, you can give them a carrot or a stick.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a carrot or is it a stick?
Right.
It's both. Trickster rabbit. Okay. So, you all know J.R.R. Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Lord of the Rings, but he was a very erudite scholar, and he wrote about the benefits in particular of stories, mythical kinds of stories, fantasy fictional, things that couldn't possibly happen in the real world. So we're back to, like, well, what would be the worth of a story that doesn't seem to pertain to us in the real world? And he uses the word escape. Well, for a long time, like, if you heard the word escapism, does that have kind of a negative connotation? Escapism?
You're kind of escaping
Reality.
reality, right?
Right. So that's really what a lot of people thought of with fantasy for a long time, of which tricksters and zombies are part of. They're like, well, that's not real, so what good is it? You can't eat it. It doesn't pertain to reality. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien would say, well, escapism could be a good thing if you're escaping into something valuable. So here we'll come back again to whether some of the mainstream movies are valuable or not. But if you have a really good story, he called them fairy stories, what it can do for you, he called it recovery. And what he meant by this is, after escaping into a really good, rich, fictional world, you can come back and recover your sense of wonder in the world and realize the miraculousness of the world, which if you're a zombie, you can't see anymore, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the trickster does, and the trickster does it. Now, here's something I didn't introduce yet. The trickster has to be tricky because it's usually a marginalized figure. If it wasn't marginalized, it could get what it needed or do what it needs to do through some other means, but it can't. So it has to be tricky, and it uses humor to point out the boundaries, the definitions, the stereotypes, pushes up against them, which might be uncomfortable if you didn't do it in a humorous, tricky way, right? So do you ever read the comments on like the New York Times website? Do you ever read about politics?
Yeah. I try
like,
not to.
Well,
but yes,
it can raise the blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at that, and people arguing, and there's been a lot of talk about this in terms of politics, people have very strongly held opinions. Well, you just try and make a rational argument, it's not going to change their mind, especially if you make them uncomfortable. So the trickster is in a unique position to engage with whatever the clear, bright line is that you thought was normal, but do it in a way that's humorous and less stressful. It's not challenging, right? Huh. So I think the trickster has a great kind of role to play as an idea, right?
Absolutely. I think of comedians in our society.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of too. Stand up.
That can really bring some of these hot button issues, make fun of it, and make people get outside of their worldview to think in different ways.
So here's another question: is there was a fellow named Bakhtin who wrote about carnival in the Middle Ages. And so carnival in the Middle Ages, it serves a very trickster-like function where power structures are inverted temporarily. The rich people dress up in rags, the poor people suddenly are eating and drinking and dancing. That lasts several days. So let's call it a steam valve. Okay. It takes those hierarchies, those power imbalances, and temporarily lets the steam off so that things can go back to the way they were. So that's the question then we have with comedians or any sort of the movies or TV shows that we think might be acting like tricksters. Are they merely distractions that function as a steam valve, right? Distract us from the important issues, that's the escapism thing, so that we don't really tackle, hello, not now.
I can hear, there you go, we can see you now.
I hate it when the machines talk to me. Like I imagine going into my kitchen and my toaster's gonna say, Kate, did you take out the garbage yet? And I'm like, oh no, did you pop up my toast yet? And it's like, oh no, did you empty the dishwasher? Because there's no clean plates to put the toast on. And I'm going, oh my God, I'm having a friggin' argument with my toaster.
It must be that sixth sense.
This is my life.
Totally is.
Your appliances come alive.
You can escape the trickster. Okay, so that's the question are things that look like they're challenging us, breaking through the barriers? Are they just a steam valve?
Mm-hmm.
Are they just something to distract us? In which case, they're basically operating secretly under the purview of the zombie. Or can they bring a lasting positive change? Right. So that's the tension. That's the dilemma. And I don't think, so I think, you know, Trickster wins. Trickster is where we want to be, but I don't think we can ever resolve it. It's in constant flux, which is a Trickster-like thing. It's like, you know, that old saying, if you're not changing or growing, you're dying, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, zombies are undead. So,
right.
Right. So it's constant. It can never really be resolved. But the Trickster reminds us that it can never be resolved, and that we have to keep. Oh, here's a funny thing. So did you ever see the old movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've seen it.
I have not.
It's a good movie. There's a 1956 version, which is really good. They had a remake in, I think, 78 with Donald Sutherland. This is why it's funny, because this is a version of a zombie. Nobody called those characters in that movie zombies, but they were basically aliens that came to Earth and took over the identity of people. And they replaced the original people with something that was very zombie-like. It wasn't violent, but it had no human emotion. It had no love. It had no, so here's one thing: Hermes and other tricksters are associated with imagination and creation and art. These aliens didn't have any of that. But here's the funny part. So here we are in a podcast. The way the aliens took over your body was they would plant this enormous pod, like a giant, disgusting okra pod, or somewhere in your house. And when you fell asleep, and then here's another sort of metaphor, right? Like people are walking around asleep, basically. When they fell asleep, the pod would come alive as an exact replica of a human. And it was really genuinely scary, because you couldn't, unlike the zombies who wear their hearts and their guts on their sleeves, you couldn't tell right off the bat whether a person was an alien or the person you loved. And pods, and here we are doing a podcast. And so, but here's one thing to link the Trickster antidote to imagination and art and productive kinds of artistic endeavors. Near the end of that film, the people are trying to get away and not turn into pods themselves, and they see a group of people in the distance, and they're not sure, but they say, wait, we hear music. They must be people, because pod people couldn't make music by definition. Unfortunately, it was just a record player that somebody put on. But that relates it back to music. So again, I was thinking of, okay, so mainstream movies, Keone. You can't tolerate them.
Well, yes.
You don't want to.
The stereotypical superhero movies, I just can't get into them. You're right. And
you too, Brian, you're there, right? You're not. Okay. So so there's two things. One is that, again, when it's very formulaic, that's right. We can certainly see there's a monetary thing pushing that. Studios make a movie that's successful, they're going to make more. But at the same time, they can't keep making formulaic things if nobody's watching them. So at some point, we have to say people want to see that story and variations of that story over and over again. It's doing something for us. We want to think about, what's it like to be a zombie? Right. What's it like to live in a world filled with zombies.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to say that. On the other hand, we can say that there are certainly movies that are like the zombies of the movie world. They are reinforcing old ideas, stale ideas, stereotypes, and therefore, so on a meta level, these movies are zombies.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of movies? I'm sticking with movies because that's my main thing. What kinds of movies are tricksters? So I mentioned art. You could say, well, an indie film could act like a trickster in that it's talking about stuff in a more nuanced way. So you could have that. But what I'm going to say is that the best trickster movie, or movie with a trickster in it, but you can have a whole movie that acts like a trickster, is one that probably is mainstream. And that's because, again, the whole point of the trickster is to bump up against the boundaries and the people who live within those boundaries. And if those people never bump up against that film, and if those boundaries are not, in other words, the boundaries have to be made obvious. If it's just an indie film dealing with blah, 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 not really thinking about that, there's no trickster function, if you see what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of, do you watch Doctor Who?
I saw the latest one.
Okay. I was just thinking this morning, Doctor Who, the character is kind of a trickster in that he's very cheeky. Tricksters are very often ambiguous. They're neither here nor there. And the Doctor Who is a Time Lord, but is he human or is he a Time Lord, or sort of both? He doesn't live here or there. Tricksters often live at the boundaries of things, at places, and he's unmoored in space and time, and he's very imaginative and open-minded. He does have a lot of power, unlike a lot of tricksters, but you can also remember that there can be a trickster component to a movie or to a character or to a person. You don't have to be all one or the other. So if I want to bring this back to reality, let's bring it back to something that's kind of contentious. What would you say about, I'm going to get into trouble here, Donald Trump?
Let me try to keep my emotions.
Yes.
All right. So Donald Trump, he is somebody that I view as that he thinks he's always right. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. That's what I think about him. I think his ego gets in the way of learning. He's constantly talking about he is the expert in everything. It appears that he doesn't use the experts around him or want to even talk to experts around him about science or anything like that because he already knows it all. So how would you classify him? I would see him as zombie-like in a couple of ways. I'd see him as him being like a master zombie for the lesser zombies in the world. But I would also see him as a puppet for a trickster to, once he's out of there, to make the world better. So I could actually see him in a positive viewpoint where, because of his disastrous trickster ways, that the world is going to get better because of him.
That's interesting. And so, Brian, do you have a thought on it?
I don't know if I really have anything to add. I think that was...
Would you agree?
I would generally agree.
So I would agree too, although I'm a little more pessimistic about the positive trickster. but I do think that, so, you know, a trickster can shade off into, and this goes to where Brian was expressing the worry early on that a trickster might not be all good. So a trickster can shade off into something less good. Con men are tricksters. The devil is a trickster, right? So, but again, going back to Lewis Hyde, the difference is the devil is out to do evil. A trickster is not. A trickster is on the margins, living outside of that. So Donald Trump is an interesting case in the sense that I think a lot of people were appealed to him because they thought he was a trickster figure who was going to shake up the system for good. But then he has this other side of the trickster, which is the con man side. And then he clearly has the zombie part where he believes what he believes and everything is black and white to him, right? So he's a really good case where you can see a single person fulfilling more than one, say, narrative function, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So as I said, I'm a little less optimistic that the chaos that he sows, and both the devil and con men and tricksters can create chaos is what they do. So that's open ended, but that's just an example of how you could use these characters or these figures or whatever as a kind of lens, if you will, to look at how the world works and remember, a lot of what is going on in politics is symbolic. It's representation. It's all. It might as well be a movie that we see, except for that, of course, it does have real consequences for us. But we consume it at the level of ideas and symbols. Right?
Okay, I think of the other part is I think of in our society, zombies being, and people that don't cherish change or don't want change. I mean, I see that in the medical field. I see it in politics, and it seems it is a fact of life that change is really what is true. I mean, change is always there and always gonna happen. And I feel like the zombies, so to speak, don't like change. They don't like being directed into another way or a positive way.
Right. And so, we talked about the fact that I came across this fabulous book by James Carse, who is a professor at NYU, and he wrote a great book back in the late 80s. I don't know how it escaped me until recently, but it's called Finite and Infinite Games, and Keone's read it. And it really resonated with me because it really reminded me of Trickster versus Zombie. Well, the Trickster versus Zombie thing was this thing that it was a keynote address, or a piece of a keynote address I gave at the University of Lisbon in Portugal a couple of years ago. And then just recently came across this book and I was like, wow, he says there's this way to look at the world. There's a finite game, if you want to use that as a model, in which somebody wins and somebody loses. The game has rules, it begins, it ends, and somebody wins and somebody loses. The other way to look at the world, which is I think the more trickster way, is the infinite game. Nobody wins, nobody loses, that's not the point. And if the game looks like it's coming to an end, the whole point of it is to keep the game going. Whatever you have to keep the game going. And it's all about opening things up, imagination, pushing the boundaries. So to me, that was like a different version of Zombies versus Tricksters, said in a much more erudite and clever way years ago. But I love that. I love that infinite game idea. And then we talked about too, he has a second book, which you should read. You haven't read it, I don't think yet, but the one about Against Religious Belief, where again, he talks about people believe something, and then once they believe it, their mind isn't open.
Yeah, they become a zombie.
Right. They think they know the answer.
Well, not only that, they think we've talked about this. They take their belief to then be truth. They can't separate the two. Right? So somebody who's Christian will say, well, that belief is true. Somebody who's Muslim will say, my belief is true. How can you have two truths? And then somebody who's Hindu will say that belief is true, but it's just a belief. And there's thousands of beliefs out there. Everybody has their different belief. My belief, which tends to be more agnostic, atheist, is really just a belief. I can't ultimately say it's the truth and that I know the truth. Whereas truth to me is, at least as your husband said, I think he said this, at least in this part of the universe, E equals MC squared is true. That's not a belief. That's a truth. Or change is constantly happening. That's a truth. That's not a belief. And I feel like zombies are constantly taking on the beliefs and then they close their mind. Their belief becomes a truth and they can't see outside that. They can't see outside of their worldview. So
here again, let me just reiterate the point why I think the trickster is so important, because we can agree on that and we can say, okay, well, we need an infinite game, but it's so much harder to do than it looks, because as far as any given person knows, they're not a zombie. They really believe stuff. They're a perfectly good person. And so
right.
The way to do it is, give a little humor, show what. I know we're getting near the end of an hour, and I'm also getting really tired. So
yeah,
can I give us one last anecdote that
yes, please,
to the synchronicity, but also brings Zombies and Tricksters together? So today is Sunday. On Friday, I knew that we were going to do this, and my mind has been out of the game a little bit because I've been sick. So I thought, well, let me look. I have a book or two. Let me just refresh my mind about some ideas about zombies, especially because zombies are not really I'm more of a trickster person. So I was looking for this really good book. In the miasma that is my office, this is not my office part. This is a nice one. In the miasma that is my office, I could not find this book. So I gave up. About an hour or two later, ding dong, my husband goes to the door. Oh, there's a package. It looks like a book. Did you order a book? No, I didn't order any book. This is addressed to you. I didn't order a book. I open it up. Undead Apocalypse. Zombies and vampires and zombies in the 21st century. Synchronicity. Turns out I had ordered it, but like 10 months ago, and I didn't pay anything for it because it was like I did a review for University of Edinburgh Press, and they said, pick out a few books and that'll be your payment. And it was on back order, something, it never came. I totally forgot about it. Totally. And it just happens to show up on Friday.
Just in time for the podcast.
Just in time.
Kate, thank you so much for being on. It's I love it. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, I love it.
Well, so you see how
we're allowed to cuss on our podcast. Brian, I don't care.
Okay, but despite the fact that there was mention of potato chips, you can see how the trickster is a part of being well, both on a personal level, being in balance, but also at the culture, right?
Right.
It is in some way.
All right. Well, so I guess maybe we should end like everybody kind of who's listening. Find out where you're a zombie in your life, and find out where you can be a trickster, but for the good. Let's be good tricksters.
But for the good. Absolutely.
But for the good. But for the good.
Bring in the.
Yes. Question. That goes back to a lot of podcasts we've had, Brian, about question your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Question your beliefs. Ultimately, if we really think about it, and this is where I go with it, ultimately, I feel like people want, generally, we go about it different ways, want good in the world. And we just have different beliefs about it. And we should all question that and come together and look for tricksters within ourselves and outside of ourselves to help us keep our thinking in tune so that we progress to make it better for everybody.
It could be your new motto. Don't be a pod. Just do a podcast.
That's right. Don't be a pod. Don't get caught up in being a pod. Absolutely. Anyway, Kate, thanks so much. This is great. We have to have you back on again. This is really cool. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
All right.